Here we go. Yay, welcome everyone to Dr Compost for this week. We have Peter Howard here with us to answer all the fabulous questions.
Yeah, sorry, I sometimes change my name to Dr Compost and sometimes I've left it as Peter Howard, but same guy.
And yeah, we've got some great questions, a lovely long list today. If there's any other questions that come up, please feel free to ask them by either unmuting yourself or popping in the chat. And we're going to, as I said before, we're just going to, the priority is going to go to the people who are here. So we can have a bit of an engagement with people in a conversation. So I'm just going to get going. Welcome again. And maybe Monica, you just mentioned that you've got your worms arrived and you're about to get them into your Subpot. Is there any questions before you have to go and look after them?
I don't think so. I used 1 cube of coconut coir, and that's getting all mushy now at this point, hopefully. Good. And I have my cardboard all cut up, all stripped up. So, and I have my mat. It's going to go in the water. I have the bucket ready for that.
Great.
And I have my bananas in the compost little pod thing on the counter. So 1 banana or 2 bananas? 1 or 2 bananas.
Oh, are you talking about the skins or the whole banana?
No, the skins.
Okay, 2 is fine.
Okay.
Yeah, you're not going to overwhelm the system. I would maybe chop them up a little bit.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I mean, if you're really feeling indulgent of those new worms, you could actually add a little bit of actual banana with it. They'd love that even more.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Excited.
Fantastic. Wonderful. Look forward to seeing it. Now we've got, who else was there? Leanne, you're here. Did you have any questions before we go on? Yes, you've got a quick question?
I don't. I think I was following the questions online and some of them are of my interest as well. So
okay, so
yeah, and if anything I'm explaining doesn't make full sense, go ahead and pop up with the chat or raise your hand and I can always clarify.
Right.
So
now we've got Becca here. She had a whole list of questions, which I haven't even looked at yet. I've just cut and pasted them into the list. So, Peter, I'm just going to start with them.
Okay.
She's new to using the Subpot and has many questions. So, number 1 is, how do you get to the next levels? Should I have added soil in addition to the worms and the coconut coir? And how small should the pieces of fruit added be? And are a whole apple core and a banana peel broken into 3 pieces too big? And can I add small amounts of food daily, or should I wait and do bigger amounts all at once? And how to know how much paper and cardboard to add? I'll start
Okay. I'll give you a general tutorial on that. So basically, what you're doing when you add the food scraps is you're breaking it up small enough so it can expose a lot of surface area on the food so that it can be colonized by microbes. And so the smaller you chop it up, the faster it'll decompose and the faster you're providing microbes for the worms. And so it's a trade-off between the effort you're willing to go to, especially when you're starting out the worm farm or the worm system. You put in a little extra trouble and you'll have constant food available for the worms and they'll divide faster. And then once the system is built up, it'll be quite resilient and you can be much more slack about the size of the pieces you put in. But in the beginning, it's worth paying a bit of attention to. As far as a core being in 3 pieces for an apple, it's probably fine. There's no sort of negative about this other than you want to supply an easily assimilated food to the worms as quickly as possible when you're first starting off. So what's happening with the bedding in the worm farm, at first there's no microbes on it, but as you stir the food in gradually over time, that'll start to become a substrate for the microbes to grow on, and then the worms can crawl around and eat both the bedding, dry carbon, and then the microbes that are growing on it. So that's kind of the way to think about it. But you won't add soil to your system because these compost worms are actually a different type of earthworm than the ones that live deep in the soil in your garden. They hang out right on the surface in nature, just right at the surface level of the soil underneath the leaves that are dropping from forest trees. And so it's actually better to leave soil out of the Subpot altogether. Eventually, when they make the casting, it'll seem a bit like soil, but it'll actually be a much richer, organically rich material than soil would be. So just let it gradually build up over time. And as far as a little bit every day, that's fine. Just keep paying attention to seeing if food starts accumulating more than the worms are getting through it. And if that starts to happen, then back off until they're able to get through it. And you might see a little mold develop if they can't get through it all quickly. Just stir that through the system, break it up, and they'll get to it. As long as you're paying attention and seeing what's going on, you'll be fine. And you can always, take a picture of your system and ask us, is this okay? And then we can give you feedback. Did I answer all the questions?
I think it was to do with how much carbon. So she says paper.
Oh, in the beginning, yeah, in the beginning, because you've started the system with all that bedding, you don't need so much carbon. It's more once the system is underway, you can get into a rhythm of, say, for 2 handfuls of food scraps, a small handful of carbon would be about right. And it'll depend roughly on how fibery the food you're adding is. So if it's mostly just fruit pulp, then you add a bit more dry carbon. But if it's, say, stalks of broccoli, you don't need as much. You can add a bit less. Just and it's a fairly relaxed kind of a system, and you'll get a feel for it over time.
Okay. Now she also said, if most of my worms are on one side, should I move half of them, or they'll migrate on their own?
No, I think it's fine. Let them go ahead and build up as they want to. Let them make their own decisions about where they want to congregate. There can be a microenvironment that they prefer inside of the Subpot, and just let them kind of freely choose what they most prefer. And you'll see over time, as the population builds up, they'll naturally start to migrate around and take up more space. But just for now, you can just go ahead and keep feeding the side you have most of the worms on until, say, you've gone up to maybe the first, past the first level. Then you might think about distributing. If one starts to build up quite a bit more than the other, then you can even them both out and then start doing alternate feedings, one side, the other side. But initially in the beginning, especially if you only have a few worms, it's actually better to concentrate the food and the worms on one side so that the population can be building up. And they actually will do well in higher density. They can find each other, and they're kind of creating their own microenvironment as they go.
And then the dead plants and flowers, should it be mixed
Okay.
with the food?
Yeah. So the thing about flowers is the petals are fine, but oftentimes you'll find the stalks of flowers are quite woody, and that's not an ideal material for the Subpot. When you think about kind of the woody type material, it generally tends to take longer to break down, and so very small amounts that are okay. But what you would find over time, if you add a lot of it, it would just keep building up in your system and then take a while to break down. So an alternative is simply to snip it up and scatter it as mulch around the base of your plants in the garden or around your raised beds, and that'll be fine. That'll should be a really good place to put that material.
Okay, is that, Becca, anything else that you need more clarification on?
Yeah, sorry, just one last thing.
Sure.
So I know it says on the inside of the Subpot, but like, how often to give them food? So I did like the week of putting them in with no food so that they could acclimate. And then should I be like, can I be putting my coffee grinds in there every day? Is this a once a week?
Yes. How many worms did you start with in your system?
2,000.
Okay, good. Yeah, I would even say that immediately, if it's been a whole week, then go ahead and immediately add some food, because I only like to wait 3 or 4 days, really. They only really need a couple of days to get established in their new home. I think a week is a bit excessive. Okay. I might talk to the powers that be about changing those guidelines so we reduce it, because you don't want the poor guys to starve in there.
Yeah.
So yeah, what the thing is with 2,000, I wouldn't add every day. I would add maybe every other day or every third day. And I would do the experiment where you add the first day, kind of have a mental note of how much you've added, and then kind of have a look after a couple days and see how much of that's disappeared, and then you'll get a feel for how much they're getting through. Coffee grounds are a particularly rich source of food for them. It's got a lot of nitrogen, even though it's black. It's actually more like a green compost food scrap food because of all the nitrogen in the seed.
Great.
But you always want diversity as well. So I would, in addition to the coffee grounds, a little bit of your fruit and veg scraps would be good.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Okay,
Now,
we've got Barbara Richmond here. She has some questions about her harvesting.
Okay.
She said, things have gone well with my Subpot and I harvested one side
Mhm.
and quit feeding the other side a few weeks ago so I could harvest it. We had a spell of hot weather. I was bad about checking in on them, and I guess most of the worms from both sides have headed from the raised garden bed because there are very few when I aerated on the usual feeding day.
Yeah.
Then she was saying maybe she should harvest while the worms were AWOL. How much should I feed now? I've been food processing the scraps, so I don't see so much of what has been eaten or not. And then she said, oops, I
Yes.
just checked on them. The cooler weather of the last few days enticed them back. But I think I'll wait for another hot spell to harvest. So yeah, just around harvesting and weather conditions and food.
Yeah, well, that's definitely the case, that if it gets hot, they'll go deeper down to avoid the really hot conditions. And if you've harvested one side and you're not going to harvest the other side right away, I would just go ahead and take the half from the other side and balance out the two sides again, because it'll create a more uniform environment inside, especially when you have uneven temperatures, because you're using the bedding inside of the Subpot as kind of a buffering environment for the worms. So by distributing it evenly, you'll provide less of a situation where one side could be drying out. So I'm just setting up my my charger here. Okay, so that's my advice about that. And then as far as the harvesting, you can wait for a hot spell, or it's not really necessary. I mean, it's the case that whenever it's sort of a time appropriate for you to spend a little while to do it, and you don't have to harvest a whole side at one time. You can just do a chunk, and then you'll have a great amount of castings for a little garden project.
Anything else, Barbara, that you'd like to ask? Like, if it's seen as though you're here, you can unmute yourself. Yep.
There. Thank you. No, I was just so surprised when I didn't see any worms on Sunday. And then after I wrote that, I thought, oh, maybe I should go out and look. And then I did, and there they were. I thought, well,
yeah,
they're back.
yeah, that's the beauty of giving them perforated walls to crawl through, so they can make their own choices about the best environment for them. And I think that's one of the real virtues of this system.
And we've got Mindy has asked, once she's harvested some castings, can it sit out for a few days before putting it on my garden?
Yeah, when you say sit out, it's fine to let them sit, but I would put them into a bucket with a lightly covered lid. The idea is that they're light sensitive. The microbes in there are active and fresh, and you're sort of retaining the moisture inside by putting it in a bucket, and keeping the light off of them by putting a loose covered lid on, but letting air exchange get inside by not sealing the lid on them. And they'll actually store in a cool environment like that for quite a while. So you can just use them at will.
So that's the castings, and you can use them to make liquid fertilizer or when you're replanting, but it's a living thing, isn't it? You've created with the castings. It's not just
it's a sort of thing where the fresher they are, the more diverse the microbial population is going to be. But it's also the case that you'll probably only need to be harvesting every 6 months or so. So realistically, you will be letting them store for a while, unless, as Catherine says, you elect to do liquid feedings, which is what I like to do in my system. So let's say you have a spring planting and you're really trying to get your plants to take off. You can get into a routine where once a week, you would just take a couple handfuls, worms and all, put it into a paint strainer bag from like you'd find in the hardware store, massage that into a bucket of water so the soluble castings are going through the strainer bag and into the water. And you can add just a little bit of a seaweed extract to that and maybe a little bit of fish emulsion, and you can water that directly on your plants. And if you do that once a week, you will be absolutely stunned by how vigorous the plants grow with that as a weekly feeding during the growth season.
Yeah, and my indoor plants love it too, I must admit.
So the nice thing about that is you're basically in kind of a routine where yes, you might have a little bit of uneaten food in that handful, you'll have the worms in there, but what happens is after you've extracted the soluble nutrients through the wall of the paint bag, you just put all that right back into the Subpot, and then the worms are fine. They're okay being underwater for a few minutes easily, not a problem. And if you're just massaging the bag rather than absolutely squeezing it hard, you're not stressing the worms. So it's actually a really good way to sort of have a continual feed of your system.
Great. Okay, now we've got Deanna here. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. She's got a question about her second Subpot that she's got. She's got a new mini, and she was asking about location, the best location for it. And she had a couple of suggestions. I don't know if Peter, you've seen them.
Yes, was that the by the power box? You have an underground power. Yeah, I saw the image, and from the camera angle, I could see that I saw a raised garden bed sitting on the far side of the power box. It was a little hard to tell how far the bed was from the power box, and I was estimating, if you're in the US, maybe what, 3 feet away or a meter away. And basically, I would say that, and you can unmute yourself if you want to clarify.
Yeah, I had gone back and added the measurements, but now I'm on my phone, so I can't see it.
Oh, it's okay.
I think it was just over 3 feet, but then Catherine had said she's more worried about the tree. So there's only one other location that really works, and it's closer to the house. It's where that electric goes into the house.
Oh yeah. No, I think it's fine. You basically want to have clearance. So if you're wheeling a wheelbarrow around your garden bed to add more soil, for instance, or service people have to service the power box, you want to give them good access on all sides. But it should be fine. I noticed there was a slope in that yard, so you may want to dig out the high side a little bit to level the bed, because there's the temptation might be to put it at an angle, but then you'll find that it just looks kind of funny with the bed following the contour of the hill, and then the soil you have to choose, is that going to be level inside, and that looks kind of like a seasick kind of garden bed.
That is like one of the 2 level spots in the yard. That's why I had thought to put it there.
And then she had, I don't know if you can see the second image that she shared, the alternative spot that's down sort of up against the house there. Are you looking at putting it sort of in that garden bed? I kind of like that myself, just because it seems like, is it closer to the house and for you to go?
It would be right next to it. And this mini is a, we'll say it's the dog's Subpot.
Oh, okay. No, maybe put it by the power box then.
Well, with the first location, all the neighbors came over to talk to me about it, which was great. But I suspect they may be trying to sneak in contributions then. And I don't know that I need help with that.
Interesting. Yeah, well, you could always put a little security camera and see who's
Because my thought was that's right next to all the front flower beds, so that's the one would be in the front yard where the other one's in the back. So that I could, like you say, deadhead any flowers into it, add the dog waste. But if the neighbors wanted to add some vegetables too, the educational lid is there
Sure. Yeah.
I did
And
make that clear,
you'll get an
sneaking
idea
stuff in.
if you have neighbors that are being conscientious. Okay, thanks, Catherine, for that.
That's the other. That's the alternative side.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of putting wet things right up against foundations. Personally, it's not great for the foundation of your house. So I generally like to keep a perimeter line around the house as much as possible.
Yeah, see, it would be right at the end of that flower bed if I did it, because the flower bed actually sits 4 feet out.
Oh, okay.
So if I
That's
turned the mini grow bed sideways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
exactly
either location. I mean, I think it's a matter of if there's a big sun difference between the two locations.
Not really.
If they're similar, then you know it'll just be. I don't have a strong feeling one over the other.
Okay.
If you like having another place to put the dog waste, then there's an argument for that.
Yeah, the first one is under a white pine tree, but it's a very mature white pine tree. So there's no, I mean, if you share the picture, I don't even think there's any branches even in the picture.
Yeah. Well, just make absolutely sure that you put a landscape fabric cloth on the soil, because you don't want to encourage tree roots growing up through the bottom of your garden bed into the planting bed, and that'll stop them from colonizing your garden bed.
Yeah, and that whole behind that pine tree is all just hostas.
Okay.
Okay, now
again, it's a hill, so you know I'm trying to catch the rain there, so that's why I was wondering if that little level spot might be a good spot.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, sounds good.
And since it's going to be a dog's compost bin, he's only 40 pounds, but a rough idea, it's a mini and it's going to be mainly used for dog waste. How many worms should I start that one with?
I would start with the same number of worms, and if the dog material is it fairly dry or is it fairly wet?
Yeah, it's probably fairly wet, close on
okay,
the
well,
on the
then that's going to be actually a pretty ideal for them. One of their favorite foods is animal manures, as long as they're not too intensely nitrogenous, like usually avian and maybe rat poop. You need to let it cool down a bit from the nitrogen, but for animals, it's fine. And it's actually, you'll see that the worms very quickly will breed up if that's their primary food source. And then you can just make sure to supply carbon as needed to get the consistency what you want.
Okay. Oh, and my secret, if you have the photo of the cilantro tree I was growing.
Yeah, I was about to say, you were asking about the cilantro as well.
I will confess to the secret of the cilantro tree probably is there's no soil in that grow bed. It's not proper soil. It is aged composted rabbit litter.
Oh, okay. Interesting. So they really like the all the goodies in that rabbit manure, probably.
Yeah, but that is 38-inch tall cilantro. I measured it this morning.
Wow.
Well, you know, the other thought I had was with that concrete wall behind, it's probably radiating out some very gentle, supportive warmth, and cilantro tends to be well, I don't know, it's warm temperate, it's Mexico. So it generally likes warmer conditions. So I think that's why it's doing better than the dill, probably.
And my thought is it gets warmer. We had talked before about maybe doing an umbrella, but that grow bed is actually sitting in an old flower bed. And what if I planted some sunflowers around that? Would that help as well to cool it off?
Sure. Yep. Anything you can do to shield the sun hitting a wall like that is going to make a difference. You could even consider putting a trellis against that wall and growing something up the wall.
Okay, that's a good idea.
You know,
Thank you.
Some nice leaf green would go really well up there.
Okay, thanks. It's actually the foundation of the garage.
Oh, okay. Well, as long as you're not you know, you could be careful to use that as a scaffold in the wall and just not have the wet at the base of it too much.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Deanna. And we've just got Dan who's joined us, and he's asking about his worms disappeared. What can I do besides getting more worms?
Okay, well, it's good I have you on. Can you unmute yourself, Dan, and we can have a little discussion about how you set up your system?
Sure, thanks.
Sure.
I set it up according to the directions.
Mm-hmm.
I used coconut noir and some cardboard, wet it down, left it for a week, and then loaded it up. Probably didn't put enough worms in it.
Okay.
I think I put 500 worms. I didn't count them, but I think I put a.
You know, it's interesting. It's interesting because I think 500 is sort of the bare lower limit you could add, and I think we've kind of put that as a possibility for people because it seems like some parts of the world worms are really in scarce supply and it starts to become quite expensive. But what I'm recommending to people that only have access to 500 or thereabouts is to actually breed them up in a little like a Tupperware type tin or Tupperware plastic bin first, you know, so it's a more small contained environment and get more of them there, say double them at least once, and then put them in, just because it's easier when you lose a few at 500, it's harder to you know, to kind of keep the population sustained. But one thing to keep in mind is that depending on the garden bed that they've migrated into, you can bring them back. And so there are certain foods to use depending on what you have access to. So like I was saying earlier in the conversation, one of their favorite foods is certain kinds of animal manure. So if you happen to be in an area where you had access to cow manure or horse manure, and the horse manure would have to be from horses that you knew weren't being dewormed, of course. But that would be a favorite food for worms. And in fact, we've had people who are very conscientious about amending their garden beds with manures, and the worms so prefer the manure that they'll actually leave the food scraps and go into the garden bed to get to the manures. So if you provided that and they're in the neighborhood, they would come running.
Well, yeah, we've thrown a fair amount of organic material down our coffee grounds, vegetable scraps and the like.
Yeah, but you can overdo it too. So if you only had 500 worms and you added a bit too much food, then what'll happen is that food can really heat up and then actually chase the worms away. And so in the beginning, especially when you only have a few worms, easy does is always better. Just starting a little bit at a time. And so if all that food is still in there, you might want to dilute it out with some more coconut coir, spread it out a bit. How much is left in the system at this point?
Oh, it's hard for me to estimate at this point, to be honest with you. But it's been about a week or more of fairly constant dumping of eggshells.
Oh, you've probably just been a little bit too enthusiastic. I think that's it.
I don't, you know, I'm enthusiastic. I just want my damn worms to be enthusiastic.
Yeah. Well, you know, there's a point where you're just smothering with a bit too much affection there. So I think if you cut back a bit on the food, so general rule of thumb is just a handful of food every few days when you're first starting out your system. And if you do more than that, it's just going to be a bit too much for the worms.
And eggshells, that might take a while for them to eat the eggshells, wouldn't it, Peter? They're kind of... Oh,
they don't really eat the eggshells. The eggshells are really there as a calcium source. And so the shells will just break down gradually over time. They're great to be adding, but don't really consider them as a food source for the worms. Think of it this way, that the worms are eating the microbes really, and so the food are providing the food for the microbes that the worms are eating. And the eggshells aren't really providing much food for microbes. And so they're more of think of them as a mineral source to sort of help actually produce the eggs for the worms, and the other ways in which calcium is useful for the worm.
So just to be clear, would I be better off removing some of the material in the Subpot?
Yes, probably at this point. What I would do is just, if you have a good bin or bucket, you can put to one side and just put
Or
it
have you got
next
an
to.
original, or have you got a mini? Because if it's an original, you could put,
Yeah,
food
I
on
think
one
I've got
side.
the original. It's the two different bays of,
Mhm.
and we've only been utilizing the one. And
Oh,
apparently
okay.
it's moist enough that mushrooms are growing in the other. I presume that's
Yeah.
a food source as well.
That's good. Mushrooms is a good sign that you have enough moisture in there, and you've got mycelia growing to produce the mushrooms, so that part's good. Yeah, so if it's like Catherine's saying, if it's in one side, then you could just focus on the other side with a bit of, now bedding is on both sides. You just were feeding one side. Okay. So step one you could try is just putting in a little bit, if you had access to a fresh manure like a cow or horse manure onto the side you haven't been feeding, just put a little bit in there. And if you have worms in the neighborhood, they will come to that. And then just let that population build up a bit first, and then gradually start the feeding again. And that'll avoid you having to go out and buy more worms. And I wouldn't consider that a substitute for organic matter. The special thing about the manure is that it's actually loaded with microbes, having just been eliminated from the animal's GI tract. And so that's what the worms are feeding on, is the microbes that are coming out of the animal. And they're fresh and abundant. So it's just, that's just if you happen to have some where you're living. If it's not convenient, then another strategy that can work is if you have access to a little bit of wheat flour, dry white wheat flour, and you add a bit of water to that, make a slurry, and just pour a small amount of that onto the side you haven't been feeding. That can also provide a substrate for microbes that could attract worms back. So try that first, and then if you're not successful, then I would bite the bullet and buy some more worms. And if it's not too expensive, I'd start with 1,000. But otherwise, if you're doing 500, I would breed them up a bit first in a bin, just given the experience you've had. And
you
then
find any other subpotters or worm breeders are nearby, you can give you a few.
Yeah, that's our hope, is that when the Subpot community grows big enough, there'll just be someone not too far from you that would be willing to just give you a handful of their Subpot contents, and you'd be good to go.
I'm sharing my worms all the time now that they've bred up. I've got somebody starts a new Subpot, I just take them over a little container of worms, and it does get to that point where you have a lot of worms, and you can easily share them around. So
I wouldn't mind getting to that point of having a lot of worms.
You'll get there. You'll get there.
will.
I'm sure of it.
It's patience. Just let them. It's a bit like
the
starting a fire.
first part is the most stressful, because you're new to it and you're waiting for it to happen. But once it's been underway, it'll be very relaxed.
You'll probably forget it when you forget about it. It's a bit like watching something to boil, watching the kettle to boil. Keep watching it.
But there are like those principles we discussed about not overfeeding. That's pretty key. Yeah.
Well, if there's any silver lining in this, the miracle grow soil that I did stick in the around the Subpot is doing wonders with tomatoes and
great,
and cucumbers. So
great.
Absent the worms, I'm not getting any compost yet, but I'm looking forward to a banner tomato crop as well as a bunch of cucumbers.
Great.
Right. Wonderful.
All right. Thank you for your advice. I appreciate it.
Sure.
You're welcome. Now we've got Christine here. She's not only posted a question in the Grow Hub, but she's here and she's got her curl grubs that she's actually gone and grabbed one for us to have a look at.
Oh,
So
okay.
if you
Maybe
unmute yourself
unmute
and
yourself
show
and
us your curl grub.
Hi guys, I'm from Brisbane, Australia.
okay.
Yeah, I was digging around. I had some beautiful cosmos flowers all around my garden recently, and we had a lot of rain, and suddenly they just died. I couldn't work out why. And then I started pulling them out of the garden, and then we had all these nice big juicy curl grubs, which traditionally in Australia are lawn problem grubs.
Oh yeah.
And or if you have a tree suddenly die in your garden, you dig up the soil, you'll find these little critters. But they were so big, and I pulled out maybe 50 of them
Wow.
in just around the subpot alone.
Wow.
So it was a bit depressing because I was like, my subpot's doing quite well. Actually, I've had a few issues, but nothing that no one else has had. And so I didn't know why they would be suddenly, whether they've just come in from the original, soil that I've put in there, and we have had a lot of extreme weather in Australia at the moment. In Brisbane, we've had a lot of rain.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure why they've.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the first step I'm thinking of, is that they're probably a bit overwhelmed by the moisture in some places, and so they're probably choosing places to be that are sort of amplifying them unusually. So, like you're saying, normally you find them in lawns and stuff. Is that the same as army worms, the curl grubs?
Well, yeah, normally they vary in size, but the ones I've been getting are like huge suckers. Like they're really like ginormous. Like I've never seen curl grubs quite so big. Like normally they're big, but not this big. And
do you have a lot of woody material in the soil? A lot of organic material there?
I built it as in what people recommended. They're quite high garden beds, and I put timber underneath and grass cuttings, and also they could have come from that. Do you think?
I think that's what's going on, because I've noticed that so for example, I'll get chip mulch delivered to my property, and I'll just let it sit and age in the garden. And invariably, whenever I'm digging that out, I'll find big, fat, juicy grubs in the middle of it. And so they're really attracted to woody material. And so I think that could be part of what you're experiencing there, is that over time, as the wood is broken down, then they'll diminish. But
what would you suggest because I'm going to have to this weekend, I've got to pull my subpot out and because with all the rain, and obviously they've eaten so much of the soil around it that I've got to reset it again. Is there anything else I should put in, or try and take some of the timber out?
Well, if you really want to avoid them altogether, then you'd have to take the timber out, probably. That'll remove their food supply, and then they'll not be drawn to being there. You could do a part if you the other thing I'm thinking about is, if you've got a stack of wood there and then you're putting the subpot right on top of that, then as the wood drops.
Yeah, there's a fair bit of gap between it, but still, yeah.
Yeah, but eventually what'll happen is the subpot would sink down, right? So
yeah, it has.
Yeah. Well, that's just kind of the nature of the way it's set up. And it's going to be the case with a deeper bed like that, is you either build a platform, either you have a compressed soil base that reaches up to the subpot, and then around that you can array the other materials, so that it never drops. That's what I'd recommend for the rebuild, is not lay it on top of something that's going to decompose faster and have it drop in the bed over time, just to avoid the hassle of having to reposition it.
Yeah, next house when we move, I'll do it differently. But we had these purposely built. We didn't realize there's not much around them. The subpot was bigger than I expected. So there's a little layer of place to build, and then there's another one. But we left a gap so the worms can get in between.
Okay.
So I could probably put a wooden, like a plastic crate, like milk crate or something that might it will take years to decompose, maybe.
Yeah, if it's a plastic crate, it'll be inert in the soil. It'll be fine.
Yeah. Okay. Just to keep everything flat. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. No worries. Thank you so much for that.
Great. All right. I'm just going to move on because we've got still a lot of questions, and we've got one here from Jim. I'm not sure it's the same Jim here, but put one in Grow Hub about the balanced diet for worms. He said that he was talking to a worm farmer recently, and he said that there's been a bit of a problem with people just feeding them meat, potatoes, and salad. So he was just saying that worms need a balanced diet like we do. If they don't get it, they'll leave. What is your opinion on this subject?
Well, so generally speaking, yeah, meat's something you would want to hold off on adding in the initial months that you're setting up your system, and after that, only small amounts. And so if 50% of what you're adding is meat, that's not going to provide an ideal environment to bring in the worms. The reason for that is it's just too rich of a food, and it tends to attract microbes that are not the preferred microbes that the worms will eat. So they're more used to decomposing leaf litter in the forest, and so they're more used to vegetable-based plant matter breaking down than heavier things like fats and oils, cheeses, and dairy and meats. So I would definitely hold off on that. The potato part is okay, but you know, if there's a chance to put in more leafy greens and some fruit and coffee grounds, that's definitely better. So I agree with that advice that you definitely want. And again, this will provide better diversity for your eventual castings as well. So just like anything, it's sort of first principles. The more diversity you feed the system, the more diverse microbes you favor, the more resilient the community of microbes, the more healthy the worms. And ultimately, when you supply that to the plants, the healthier the plants will be, because they're having a repertoire of microbes to support them that is diverse. So when possible, diversity, and yeah, it's just for the human diet, of course, as well, for our gut microbiota. We'd also like to have the same diversity. So you know, it's hard to talk people out of the meat and potato diet. So I have relatives that favor that. So you'll have to be creative, put in some wild-crafted weeds and stuff, maybe.
Okay, now Monica's asking what mulch do you suggest for around the plants that are around the subpot?
Well, in Australia, the easy one is you can get shredded organic sugarcane mulch, which is nice for raised garden beds, because it's a combination of it'll hold the moisture in, it'll break down relatively quickly, it'll still let water in. So the properties you want are to sort of create a blanket of still air to help buffer the soil. You want it to have airspace so the soil can breathe, and you want rain to be able to penetrate it. So those are the properties you're generally looking for. If you have access to rotting down leaves, you can spread those on. But again, if they're just dried leaves, leaves take a surprising amount of time to start breaking down, and they could actually provide a barrier between the air and the soil and when it rains. So that's a good choice here. Other places, the standard things are straw and hay are good choices. They can be annoying though. The strands of straw, depending on what you're growing, can get in the way. So if it's shredded, it's easier to work with. And then I would avoid putting in, say, wood chip in a raised garden bed. I think that's better suited around fruit trees and nut trees rather than in raised garden beds, because it's so woody that it tends to sort of interfere with the rapid growth of vegetables, and better suited to perennials than annuals.
And don't they say some of those hard chipped trees actually strip nitrogen out of the soil to break it down, like they take nutrients to
Yeah, I mean that's the dogma, is that if you add too much wood onto soil, the decomposition process will take nitrogen and you can deplete that from the soil. But you know, that depends quite a bit on the health of your soil in general. And in general, what happens is a lot of that wood is going to be broken down by fungus rather than bacteria, and they're going to be. I mean, it's a big conversation around free living bacteria also supplying some nitrogen to the soil, but generally speaking, yeah, you want to avoid having the heavier woody stuff in a raised garden bed. Although I would say that it's a fantastic mulch around your trees in the ground, because in my property, for instance, I use a very thick layer of woody mulch, about a couple meters in perimeter around my trees, and after a year you get fantastic soil below that, so it's providing a lot of carbon for microbes, and so you get a really nice aerated soil, and the tree can put feeder roots into it, and it holds moisture really well.
Especially if you put a bit of manure in there. Now, look, Deanna's just said that sometimes farmers will let you clean up their barns of the fluff that falls from bales of hay. That would be good mulch, or is it too small? I reckon that'd be good.
Yep, that could work. Yeah, sure.
All right, now I'm just going to move on. Sorry to cut you short there on that one, but I've got Regina here. She's got some questions she would like to ask before we get back to our list. So, Regina, over to you.
Oh, you have to unmute yourself, Regina.
There we go.
Yay.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, I live in Spokane, Washington,
Mhm.
and the temperatures get below freezing. And I had actually bought about 2,000 worms and put them in, and then the temperature dropped to between 27 and 29 at night.
Wow.
And
Okay.
I lost them all. So I was wondering, you did comment that, I can look at your site and find out how to insulate that, probably with straw and stuff. I'm wondering, is that going to be enough to keep them alive?
The nice thing for you is that there's a number of people in the Oregon and Washington areas that have applied just those remedies, and that has been sufficient for them. And so I'm not 100% sure that their conditions are analogous to yours, but it could be enough. Surprisingly, if you have, say, for example, another level beyond that is you add a simple cold frame, if you know what that is. Cold frame is just like a simple glass box you pop on top of it. That'll take you all the way through winter just fine, and just the sun shining into that heats up the air enough that would work in most of the continental US, actually.
So I am not opposed like a lot of Washington and Oregon, but kind of closer to Canada and Idaho, up in that northwest corner, or north corner. So it gets pretty cold. So we have a big electric box in the front yard, which we fence around for rabbits anyways, and a garden. I could put it out there, 3 feet away from it, and then drape a tarp over it, and that would keep it warm. Is that
Yeah, but you want to make sure you're not restricting airflow. So if you're keeping that over it 24 hours a day, you'd be defeating some of the aeration that you want to really promote through the panels at the top of the Subpot. So there are some very inexpensive cold frames that are kits you can buy. I think even Walmart has one that you could just buy for $20, something like that, where they're plastic walls.
Would that reduce the air too?
It should have some air. Yeah, the way it's sitting, you'd want to make sure that the way it's sitting on top of the bed, that you're letting some airflow go through it. But the advantage of that too is that you're letting the sunlight, when it is shining, get in, and it'll warm up the airspace underneath. Whereas if it's just an opaque box, you lose that opportunity.
Okay, and then my last question is, can I put chicken droppings along with shredded pine and sand in the Subpot?
I would avoid putting too much shredded pine and sand in, and for the chicken droppings, I would let them pacify quite a bit first. Those are all materials that would be great amendments for garden soil, more than putting into the Subpot. So those are all great things to dig around existing plants in the garden. Do you have space where you could be using them, or?
Possibly some of it. Yeah, not all of it.
Yeah. Yeah, the sand would just build up over time. It's not really providing a good benefit to the bedding generally, because it's a fairly heavy material. And then you'll just end up with that in the middle of your castings when you go to harvest them. So yeah, I think I would just use that. Where's the sand coming from?
I'm not sure yet. I just got the chicken coop made and getting ready to go to the next step.
Okay. Yeah. Well, the chicken coop, the droppings are going to be an excellent fertilizer, but what you could do is just when you collect that material, let it rot down a bit first, and then you could spread that as a wonderful kind of rotted down manure around plants, and they'll actually do quite well with it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thanks, Regina. Now I just want to get back to a couple of the ones from Grow Hub. You going okay there, Peter? Your voice is holding.
Yeah. No, I'm okay.
Right. Okay. So look, we've got this one from Leather Wolf. He's just said that here in WNC, you probably know where that is, we have heavy clay soil. Do I need to be concerned that the worms will drown, or will they retreat into the compost when it rains?
Yeah, so from that question, it makes me think that he's actually digging the Subpot into the ground directly, which I don't recommend doing in heavy clay soils, because basically it's kind of creating a sweat box for the worms where they can't really get away. That heaviness of the clay soil means it holds a lot of moisture. They actually have a hard time getting out of the walls of the Subpot through that material. So in heavy clay soils, you're better off setting up a simple raised bed and putting it on the surface of the heavy clay. And it'll benefit you in a lot of ways. The plants will actually grow better in a raised bed on heavy clay land. And then when it's very wet, all the excess water will drain easily from your raised bed, rather than kind of flood your Subpot system. So we can confirm with Leather Wolf that he's meaning digging into the ground. If he's got a raised garden bed, then just choose a different soil to fill into the raised bed than the soil that he's got on his land. Pick something that's well draining. You might have to go to a landscape shop and buy what they would consider a garden soil that has the properties of holding moisture but draining well.
And make sure it's not at a low end of the yard so that the water doesn't flow in that
It's
direction.
funny about that, because I was always thinking before that in heavy rains you'd want to be on high ground, because if you're in heavy clay soil, the water tends to pool at the bottom and it'll flood your system. But here we've been having such heavy rains, we're getting landslips. So in the higher areas, the soil actually gets so heavy that structurally it starts to break, and you end up slipping large surfaces of it. So unfortunately, when there's heavy rains, there's no easy, good place for these things.
Okay, so now we've got the next question that came in about how dry is too dry. Been worried about letting my compost get too wet because of reading about other issues. So how dry is too dry? Only about 54 degrees here. I'm southwest Wisconsin, and the worm mat that came with my Subpot was totally dry this afternoon after soaking it yesterday. Things are light and airy in the Subpot. I'm concerned about it being too dry now.
Yeah.
My worms, the bedding, added coir and shredded cardboard are present, along with one puree feeding of water, banana, mushroom scrapes.
Yeah, it's definitely, I would err on the side of being a little wetter than a little drier. So the worms will tolerate wetter conditions better than conditions that are a bit too dry. And so it could be the case that at 54 degrees, you have very low humidity in that air, and it's just pulling all the humidity out of the ground. And that's why it's drying so fast. So it's not necessarily the case that because it's drying fast at 54, it's going to dry faster when it heats up, because it's all about relative humidity. As the air heats up, it'll hold more moisture. And so it may or may not be as drying. depending on how much proximity you have to a lake or an ocean that will pull moisture out of that body of water to balance things. So these are all factors. But just what I was recommending on Grow Hub when I answered this question was to just get into the habit of putting your hand into the bedding before you feed and seeing if it seems a bit too dry, and then have your watering can at the ready. You can put in a slug of water from the watering can in addition to your food scraps, and a little bit maybe less carbon, and give that a stir so that you're supplementing water if it tends to be lost because your climate is so dry. And the other thing about that is make sure that the soil around the garden bed, or around the subpot, is well mulched. So it's not leaving the soil around the subpot and then pulling it out of the bedding as the soil around the subpot dries out.
Yeah, you want the soil to be damp as well too, yeah, around the subpot. Great. And
yeah,
Leanne,
so just to reiterate, sorry, just to finish that. So just keep it moist now, and then just keep paying attention. You'll see what happens when it warms up. You may or may not have to do a similar approach, depending on the relative humidity as it warms up.
You start to get a feel for it after a while, you know, that it's kind of like having nice moist soil, you know, damp soil.
Well, if you're, I mean, this isn't an intuitive thing people would feel, but generally when I've read what worms like is 60% moisture. So that's pretty wet. If you took a handful of bedding and you gave it a squeeze, you'd see water starting to seep a little bit between your fingers. At that point, if it's dripping actively from your hands, that's a bit over wet. But you want it to be nice and moist, because the worms are breathing through their skin, and they need that moisture to kind of protect them from drying out.
Great. Now, Leanne does share that she's also in Washington and can get cold there. In the past, she's used plug-in heated worm blankets.
Good idea.
Are those okay to use?
Well, it's just a matter of if you're providing a little auxiliary heat, because there was someone else in Seattle that was using germination pads, and I would imagine it would be a similar sort of temperature boost, you know, maybe 10, 15 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's going to be fine. That's not going to overheat the worms at all. And so
that's what they are. Were seed starter blankets that was at my kids' school that we were using that, and it really kind of did help a bit. Yeah.
Good idea.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I was suggesting low tech and high tech solutions. So I was calling that a high tech solution. If you have access to electricity at your site and you can run that.
Okay, now we've got Myrtle Cleary who was asking, why do worms eat worm blankets?
Oh, so the nice thing about the worm blankets is because it is a biodegradable basic source of carbon for the worms. They're going to tuck into it as part of their eating of carbon. And if you want them to eat the worm blanket more slowly, then just make sure you're adding a bit of carbon when you're adding your food. And then the other thing you can do is you can elevate the blanket a bit further so it doesn't get eaten so fast. What I've recommended to people too is if you're in an area where the soil's not drying out too fast, you can let the blanket dry out, and the worms will be less likely to eat it as quickly when you let the worm blanket dry than if you keep it moist all the time. So keeping the blanket moist is mostly done because the air temperature is really dry and you're protecting against drying out the bedding, or because you have pesky ants that like dry conditions getting into your subpot, and by having a wet blanket, you discourage them from taking up residence in the subpot. But otherwise, letting it dry out will actually make the blanket last a bit longer.
Yeah, great. And then Annette Young was asking about veggie scraps with bugs. She's super new. She's going to get her worms this weekend and get started. One question so far, is it okay to put veggie scraps that might contain bugs in the subpot? I am growing 2 cabbages in my garden. One looks gorgeous. The other is almost black from being eaten by aphids.
Oh
Can I
no.
pop that entire cabbage into the Subpot, even though it's mostly eaten and might contain little critters? And then she was also curious about throwing things in versus blending scraps first.
Well, I would chop up that cabbage well before she puts it in. There's no need to blend it. Yeah, that's a matter of personal choice. If you're growing plants that you're trying to eat around the subpod, and you end up sort of providing a habitat for pests that are going to eat your crops, then that's not so great. So if you're just using the subpod to compost, then it's fine. So for example, in her case, the subpot is well away from her garden bed where she's growing the cabbages, then it's okay. But otherwise, she's providing a nursery for more of the same. So I wouldn't.
We've got a whole lot of
recommend.
ladybugs or a lot of lady beetles to come and start keeping the population of aphids.
Yeah, they're not going to have much access inside the subpot, unfortunately. Yeah.
Alrighty, now we're just on to Eric Howell, has got a question about sifting his compost from his mini for the first time. And it clumped together, so it's very moist. What's a good way to dry it out for easy sifting? He says, I know I could add more torn up paper cardboard, but that would take more time to break down and maybe harder to sift. Any thoughts?
Yeah, my first thought was if you had access to powdered charcoal, that could actually help dry it out. I was thinking hard about this one because ideally you want something that pulls the moisture up, but that doesn't diminish the quality of your casting material. And if you add, say, other sources of dry carbon, they're not decomposed the way your castings are, and so they're less ideal. Whereas if you happen to have a powdered charcoal, if you happen to know about this, that's basically the starting point of biochar. So when you put charcoal into soil, it provides habitat for microbes. And over time, that can actually increase the fertility of your soil. And so if you added that to dry out the castings, you wouldn't be diminishing the quality of the castings. Now, you have to be a bit careful because the pH of the charcoal could be a bit high. And so if you still have worms in the castings, you wouldn't want to overdo it. But you add it in small amounts, just enough to maybe help with the clumps, so it's easier to sift it. But the other thing I suggested to Eric was that I read an article on the Grow Hub about another way to separate the worms from the castings. When I wrote about people who have minis where you don't have 2 separate chambers and you've got to be dealing with uneaten food that you're separating as well. In this case, I'm simply, you'll see the article in the composting section on the Grow Hub, where you can just basically pull the castings out of your bin, and by hand you can scrape the upper layer, and then you don't have to worry about the texture of the castings. They can be a bit clumpy, and it's fine. So that's another option. But you know, as a third option, if you want to stick with the sifting approach, because it can be quick, and if you've got kind of a nice routine with your sifter, then you as a second choice, you could add some sawdust, which would dry out the clumps as well. But then just know that you'll be providing a carbon source that's part of the castings that then has to be broken down when that's added to the soil. So it wouldn't be as complete a compost as if you hadn't added it.
Okay, so then I think there was just moldy vegetables scraps are okay, aren't they? I mean,
yeah, they're fine. So generally what happens is if you have mold spores colonizing either bread or vegetables or things, just make sure that you chop it and spread it around so it's not creating a big clump of growth in one corner of your subpod. But that's all ultimately when that's spread around and broken down, that's just more food for the system.
Great. Now we've got Michaela, who's just graduated in biology, and she's to celebrate. She's bought herself a Subpot, and she was asking for the best advice you can give a compost newbie, and then a question about blending their food before putting it in. Is that necessary or just an added step?
Yeah, congratulations on your BS in science. That's great. Off to a new career of thinking about science with a degree in it. What I'd recommend is when you're starting at your system is provide the best habitat for the worms you can. And so it's worth splurging on bedding, you know, buying a brick or two of the finely shredded coconut coir so that you're providing habitat that both holds moisture well, but is fibrous and brings in lots of air. And so the worms will want to stick around in it rather than leaving. And as to blending up the food scraps, in the beginning, the benefit of that is you're maximally creating surface area so that you can spread that around to that virgin surface of the coconut coir and start colonizing it with the microbes quickly, so that you're creating a rich microbial substrate for the worms to travel through and feed at will. And so if you did that for the first few weeks, you'll provide the gentlest possible introduction for the worms, and they'll reward you with dividing and building up the population a bit faster. But after that, you can be much more relaxed about chopping coarsely and then just putting that into your kitchen caddy and then putting those directly into your Subpot, and it'll be fine.
Great. Okay, and one last question, because we've really gone over time this time, is just about the green grub that Eric had found. He's wondering whether it's eating his lettuces. I will try and do a screen share.
Yeah, I saw a picture. It was a caterpillar. I think the other picture is more obvious.
Oh, is this one not?
Look at a second picture.
Okay, that's the one from the top. Let me see if I can find the other one.
Oh, it's just the one right below it. But anyway, it's a caterpillar, and it's going to be a voracious eater of any new growth. And so I'm merciless when I find caterpillars in my garden beds. They get squished between my finger and thumb, and that's it. Well, no mercy. I'm nice to animals, but I draw the line at caterpillars.
All right.
Sometimes people yeah, there you go. That's
it looks like it's a white cabbage moth larvae to me.
It could be, but in any case, it's going to be a nightmare for your cruciferous vegetables and any of the sort of thinner leafy green vegetables. And some people will actually crush the middle of them and then leave them out on the plant to let the other moths know, hey, this isn't a good place to lay your eggs. Not sure if that works or not, but
he was also asking about aphids. You know, neem oil okay for vegetables that we want to eat, or should we pick the soap and water mixture?
Neem is actually going to be better if you had any residue of neem on your vegetables for eating than a bit of soap. So neem oil is great. I've used it quite a bit. You have to reapply it, of course, after it rains, because it'll wash off. But it's good. It's good material.
Okay, and then one last here from Regina before we shut this session down for the week. Mix coconut shell with greens. Do you mean the coconut coir fibre, or do you mean that? Yeah. I think that's one of Peter's favourite worm food. I can't hear.
Well, I just like to get people started with that because it solves so many problems. You don't have to be an expert. If you start with that material, then the worms basically are much more resilient, and you can be finding your way in your system, and the worms will manage it better. So luckily it's inexpensive. It's a renewable resource. It's way better than the peat that they used to dig up in the forest in northern Canada. So I consider it kind of a complete replacement for conventional peat. And in fact, it's better because it's pH neutral rather than acidic the way old-fashioned peat was.
True. All right, mix with greens, Virginia is saying.
Well, you can, so that may be person using a bit of, if they mean shredded coconut coir, you
Virginia,
definitely would never want to put
unmute
coconut
yourself?
shell
Maybe
in
just-
your Subpot. It would take forever to break down.
we can't hear you. Yeah, I was wondering if there was a. Oh no, you're still muted. Anyway, oh, there
Oh,
she is.
she's unmuted.
The brown brick.
Yes. Yes,
So mix it
perfect.
with the greens.
Yeah,
You
that's fine. I
rehydrate
mean,
it first.
you're talking about when you're adding new food to your Subpot or when you're first setting it up.
Both. Can you mix the new food in with that coconut?
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great carbon source, and it's one of those ones that we recommend if your system gets a little bit out of whack, like a little bit, it really helps to bring it back into balance. And if it may be too wet or something, it can absorb a lot of the moisture.
It holds moisture really well, so it's a great sponge, biological sponge. But at the same time, unlike other things that hold moisture, it's fibrous, and so it lets in air at the same time. So it's one of the few things that does both really well.
Yeah, we are working on developing our Subpot coir peat impregnated with microbes.
But that's not really necessary because the worms come pre-stocked with microbes in their gut, and as soon as they start feeding, they're secreting great beneficial microbes right into your coconut coir. So that's only maybe in the initial setup stage. It could be as a starter packet.
Wonderful. Wow, that was a very big full session. So thanks everyone for being here. It's so nice to see you live and to get the questions and have a bit of interaction.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got a lovely big long list of questions. If we've missed anyone, I'm sorry, just check the recording. I think Peter's also been answering questions actually in Grow Hub as they have been turning up. So another great place just to check back and see if there's any more responses there that can help. And yeah, we'll be here again next week. So share your questions and hope to see you again. So
happy composting, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.